The de Havilland DH.100 Vampire was a British jet fighter developed and manufactured by de Havilland, having been developed during the Second World War to harness the newly developed jet engine. The Vampire entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1945. It was the second jet fighter, after the Gloucester Meteor, operated by the RAF, and its first to be powered by a single jet engine. The RAF used the Vampire as a frontline fighter until 1953, when it was given secondary roles such as pilot training. It was retired by the RAF in 1966, replaced by the Hawker Hunter and Gloucester Javelin. It achieved several aviation firsts and records, including being the first jet aircraft to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The Vampire had many export sales and was operated by various air forces. It participated in conflicts including the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Malayan Emergency and the Rhodesian Bush War. Almost 3,300 Vampires were manufactured, a quarter of them built under license in other countries. The Royal Navy's first jet fighter was the Sea Vampire, a navalised variant which was operated from its aircraft carriers. The Vampire was developed into the DH.115 dual-seat trainer and the more advanced DH.112 Venom ground attack and night fighter. Development origins under Air Ministry Specification E641 for 2 prototypes. Design work on the DH.100 began at the de Havilland Works at Hatfield in mid-1942, 2 years after the Meteor. Originally named the Spider Crab, the aircraft was entirely a de Havilland project, exploiting the company's extensive experience in building with molded plywood for aircraft construction. Many of the basic design features were first used in their Mosquito fast bomber. It had conventional straight mid-wings and a single jet engine placed in an egg-shaped, aluminium-skinned fuselage, exhausting in a straight line. The Vampire was considered to be a largely experimental design due to its unorthodox arrangement and the use of a single engine, unlike the Gloucester Meteor, which was already specified for production. The low power output of early British jet engines meant that only twin-engine aircraft designs were considered practical, but as more powerful engines were developed, particularly Frank Halford's H-1, a single-engine jet fighter became possible. De Havilland were approached to produce an airframe for the H-1, and their first design, the DH-99, was an all-metal, twin-boom, tricycle undercarriage aircraft armed with 4 cannon. The use of a twin boom kept the jet pipe short, avoiding the power loss of a long pipe that would have been needed in a conventional fuselage. The DH-99 was modified to a mixed wood and metal construction in light of Ministry of Aircraft production recommendations, and the design was renumbered to DH-100 by November 1941. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the de Havilland chief test pilot and son of the company's founder, test flew prototype serial number LZ-548G on its maiden flight on 20 September 1943 from Hatfield. The flight took place only 6 months after the Meteor's maiden flight. The first Vampire flight had been delayed due to the need to send the only available engine fit for flight to America to replace one destroyed in-ground engine runs in Lockheed's prototype XP-80. The production Vampire Mki did not fly until April 1945, with most being built by English Electric Aircraft at their Preston, Lancashire factories due to the pressures on de Havilland's production facilities, which were busy with other types. Although eagerly taken into service by the RAF, it was still being developed at war's end, and never saw combat in the Second World War. Further development: de Havilland initiated a private venture night fighter, the DH-113, intended for export, fitting a 2-seat cockpit closely based on that of the Mosquito night fighter, and a lengthened nose accommodating AIMKX radar. An order to supply the Egyptian Air Force was received. but this was blocked by the British government as part of a general ban on supplying arms to Egypt. Instead, the RAF took over the order and put them into service as an interim measure between the retirement of the de Havilland Mosquito night fighter and the full introduction of the Meteor night fighter. Removal of the radar from the night fighter and fitting of dual controls gave a jet trainer, the DH.100 Vampire, which entered British service as the Vampire T-11. This was built in large numbers, both for the RAF and for export. A total of 3,268 Vampires were built in 15 versions, including a twin-seat night fighter, a trainer and a carrier-based aircraft designated Sea Vampire. The Vampire was used by some 31 air forces. Germany, the Netherlands, Spain and the US were the only major Western powers not to use the aircraft type. In 1947, Wing Commander Maurice Smith, editor of Flight magazine, stated upon piloting his first jet-powered aircraft, a Vampire Mk3, "Piloting a jet aircraft has confirmed one opinion I had formed after flying as a passenger in the Lancastrian jet test beds, that few, if any, having flown in a jet-propelled transport, will wish to revert to the noise, vibration and attendant fatigue of an air-screw-propelled piston-engined aircraft." Records and achievements. On 8 June 1946, the Vampire was introduced to the British public when Fighter Command's 247 Squadron was given the honour of leading the flypast over London at the Victory Day celebrations. The Vampire was a versatile aircraft, setting many aviation firsts and records, being the first RAF fighter with a top speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. On 3 December 1945, a Sea Vampire piloted by Captain Eric Winkle Brown became the first pure jet aircraft to land on and take off from an aircraft carrier. Vampires were used in trials from 1947 to 1955 to develop undercarriage-less fighters that could operate from flexible rubber decks on aircraft carriers, which would allow the weight and complication of an undercarriage to be eliminated, despite demonstrating that the technique was practicable, with many landings being made with undercarriage retracted on flexible decks both at RAF Farnborough and on board the carrier HMS Warrior. The proposal was not taken further. On 23 March 1948, John Cunningham, flying a modified Mki with extended wingtips and powered by a de Havilland Ghost engine, set a new world altitude record of 59,446 feet. On 14 July 1948, 6 Vampire F-3s of No. 54 Squadron RAF became the first jet aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean when they arrived in Goose Bay, Labrador. They went via Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, Keflavik in Iceland and Bluey West 1, Greenland. From Goose Bay Airfield they went on to Montreal to start the RAF's annual Goodwill Tour of Canada and the US, where they gave formation aerobatic displays. At the same time, USAF Colonel David C. Schilling led a group of F-80 Shooting Stars flying to Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base in Germany to relieve a unit based there. There were conflicting reports later regarding competition between the RAF and USAF to be the first to fly the Atlantic. One report said the USAF squadron delayed completion of its movement to allow the Vampires to be the first jets across the Atlantic. Another said that the Vampire pilots celebrated winning the race against the rival F-80s design. The Vampire was first powered by a Halford H-1 producing 2,100 lb-f of thrust, designed by Frank B. Halford and built by de Havilland. The engine was a centrifugal flow type, a design later superseded after 1949 by the slimmer axial flow units. Initially, the Goblin gave the aircraft a disappointingly limited range. This was a common problem with all the early jets, and later marks were distinguished by greatly increased fuel capacities. As designs improved, the engine was often upgraded. Later MKs used the Goblin II, the F3 onwards used the Goblin III. Certain marks were testbeds for the Rolls-Royce Nene, leading to the FB30 and 31 variants built in Australia. Due to the low positioning of the engine, a Vampire could not remain on idle for long, as the heat from the jet exhaust would melt the tarmac behind the aircraft. Operational history. RAF and Royal Navy service. In post-war service, the RAF employed the Gloucester Meteor as an interceptor and the Vampire as a ground attack fighter bomber. The first prototype of the Vampire fighter bomber Mk5, modified from a Vampire F3, carried out its initial flight on 23 June 1948. The FB-5 retained the Goblin III engine of the F3, but featured armor protection around engine systems, wings clipped back by 1 foot, and longer stroke main landing gear to handle greater takeoff weights and provide clearance for stores. Weapons load. An external tank or 500-pound bomb could be carried under each wing, and 8 3-inch rocket projectiles could be stacked in pairs on 4 attachments inboard of the booms. Although an ejection seat was considered, it was not fitted. At its peak, 19 RAF squadrons flew the FB-5 in Europe, the Middle East and the Far East. The FB-5 undertook attack missions during the British Commonwealth's campaign to suppress the insurgency in Malaya in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The FB-5 fighter bomber became the most numerous single-seat variant with 473 aircraft produced. The NF-10 served from 1951 to 1954 with 3 squadrons but was often flown in daytime as well as nighttime. After replacement by the Venom, conversions were made to NF-10 standard for operation by the Central Navigation and Control School at RAF Shawbury. Others were sold to the Indian Air Force. The RAF eventually relegated the Vampire to advanced training roles in the mid-1950s, and the type was generally out of RAF service by the end of the decade. Following carrier landing trials on the carrier HMS Ocean with a modified prototype Vampire, the Royal Navy ordered a navalised variant of the Vampire FB-5 as the Sea Vampire, the first Royal Navy jet aircraft. 2 prototypes were followed by 18 production aircraft which were used to gain experience in carrier jet operations before the arrival of the 2-seat Sea Vampire T-22 trainers. The final Vampire was the T model, first flown from the old Airspeed Limited factory at Christchurch, Hampshire on 15 November 1950. Production deliveries of the trainer began in January 1952. The T models remained in service with the RAF until 1966. There was a Vampire trainer in service at CFS RAF Little Rissington until at least January 1972. Australia in 1946 approval was given for the purchase of an initial 50 Vampire aircraft for the RAF. The first 3 machines were British-built aircraft, an F1, F2 and FB-5, and were given serial numbers A78-1 to A78-3. The second aircraft, the F2, was significant in that it was powered by the more powerful Rolls-Royce Nene jet engine, rather than the usual Goblin. All 80 F-30 fighters and FB-31 fighter bomber aircraft built by de Havilland Australia were to be powered by Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. Versions of the Nene engine manufactured under license in Melbourne. The Nene required a greater intake cross-section than the Goblin, and the initial solution was to mount auxiliary intakes on top of the fuselage behind the canopy. Unfortunately, these intakes led to elevator blanking on formation of shock waves, and 3 aircraft and pilots were lost in unrecoverable dives. All Nene-engined aircraft were later modified to have the auxiliary intakes beneath the fuselage, thus avoiding the problem. The first Vampire F-30 fighter flew in June 1949, and it was followed by 56 more F-30 variants before the final 23 aircraft were completed as FB-31s with strengthened and clipped wings with underwing hardpoints. The last FB-31 was delivered in August 1953, and 24 late production F-30s were subsequently upgraded to FB-31 standard. Single-seat Vampires were retired in the RAF in 1954. The T-33, T-34 and T-35 were used by the RAF and the Royal Australian Navy, and many were manufactured or assembled at de Havilland Australia's facilities in Sydney. The Mk-35W was an Mk-35 fitted with spare Mk-33 wings following overstress or achievement of fatigue life. Vampire trainer production in Australia amounted to 110 aircraft, and the initial order was filled by 35 T-33s for the RAF. Deliveries being made in 1952, with 5 T-34s for the RAN delivered in 1954. The trainers remained in service in the RAF until 1970, while RAN Vampires were retired in 1971. Canada. An F-1 version began operating on an evaluation basis in Canada at the Winter Experimental Establishment in Edmonton in 1946. The F-3 was chosen as one of two types of operational fighters for the Royal Canadian Air Force and was first flown in Canada on 17 January 1948, where it went into service as a Central Flying School training aircraft at RCAF Station Trenton. With 86 in total, the F-3 was the first jet fighter to enter RCAF service in any significant numbers. It served to introduce fighter pilots not only to jet flying, but also to cockpit pressurization and the tricycle landing gear. The Vamp was a popular aircraft, easy to fly and considered a hot rod. It served in both operational and air reserve units until retirement in the late 1950s, when it was replaced by the Canadair Sabre. Egypt. In 1954, Egypt was operating 49 Vampires, acquired from Italy and Britain, as fighter bombers. In 1955, 12 Vampire trainers were ordered, with delivery starting in July that year. The Egyptian Air Force lost 3 Vampires in combat with Israeli jets during the Suez Crisis. Finland. The Finnish Air Force received 6 FB-52 Vampires in 1953. The model was nicknamed Vampy in Finnish service. An additional 9 twin-seat T-55s were purchased in 1955. The aircraft were assigned to second wing at Pori, but were transferred to first wing at Tikkakoski at the end of the 1950s. The last Finnish Vampire was decommissioned in 1965. Indian 07 Squadron. Indian Air Force received Vampires in January 1949. Although the unit was put on high alert during the Sino-Indian War of 1962, it did not see any action, as the Air Force's role was limited to supply and evacuation. No. 17 Squadron IAF also operated the type. On 1 September 1965, during the Indo-Pakistani War, IAF Vampires saw action for the first time. No. 45 Squadron responded to a request for strikes against a counter-attack by the Pakistani Army, and 4 Vampire Mk-52 fighter bombers were successful in slowing the Pakistani advance. However, the Vampires encountered 2 Pakistan Air Force F-86 Sabres, armed with air-to-air missiles, in the ensuing dogfight. The outdated Vampires were outclassed. 1 was shot down by ground fire and another 3 were shot down by Sabres. The Vampires were withdrawn from frontline service after these losses. Norway. The Royal Norwegian Air Force purchased 20 Vampires F-3s, 36 FB-52s and 6 T-55 trainers. The Vampire was in use in Norway from 1948 to 1957, equipping a 3-squadron Vampire wing at Gardermoen. The Vampires were withdrawn in 1957 when the Air Force re-equipped with the Republic F-84G Thunderjet. The Vampire trainers were replaced by the Lockheed T-33 in 1955 and returned to the United Kingdom and used by the Royal Air Force. Sweden. The Swedish Air Force purchased its first batch of 70 FB-1 Vampires in 1946, looking for a jet to replace the already outdated Saab 21 and J-22s of its fighter force. The aircraft was designated J-28A and was assigned to the F-13 Norrköping wing. It provided such good service that it was selected as the backbone of the fighter force. A total of 310 of the more modern FB-50, designated J-28B, were purchased in 1949. The last one was delivered in 1952, after which all piston-engine fighters were decommissioned. In addition, a total of 57 two-seater DH.100 Vampires called J-28C were used for training. The Swedish Vampires were retired as fighters in 1956 and replaced with J-29 and J-34. The last Vampire trainer was retired in 1968. Switzerland. The Swiss Air Force purchased in 1946 4 DH-100 F-1. One aircraft crashed on 2 August 1946, the other three remained in service until 1961. The first batch of 75 DH-100 Mk6 was purchased in 1949. Most of them passed out of service in 1968-1969, the last ones in 1973. The second batch was 100 DH-100 Mk6 built under license by the Swiss aviation industry, in use from 1951 to 1974 and in storage until 1988. 3 DH-100 Mk6 were built from spare parts. 1 DH-113 NF-10 1958 to 1961. 39 DH-115 Mk55 Vampire two-seat trainers from 1953 to 1990. Rhodesia. The Rhodesian Air Force acquired 16 Vampire FB-9 fighters and a further 16 Vampire T-11 trainers in the early 1950s, its first jet aircraft, equipping 2 squadrons. These were regularly deployed to Aden between 1957 and 1961, supporting British counterinsurgency operations. 21 more two-seaters and 13 single-seaters were supplied by South Africa in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Rhodesia operated Vampires until the end of the Bush War in 1979. In 1977, 6 were pressed into service for Operation Dingo. They were eventually replaced by the BAE Hawk 60 in the early 1980s. After 30 years' service, they were the last Vampires used on operations anywhere in the world.